Good afternoon, good morning, welcome to today's webinar, which is all about editing travel and street photography, mostly street I think we have today. So that's looking at some techniques that we can use to cope with certain obviously lighting conditions that you can't control, drawing the eye into the subject, local adjustments, dodging and burning, all kinds of other fun stuff that should work out quite nicely. Before we get started, let's just look at some housekeeping. So as usual, we have a maximum of 60 minutes to use today. We'll probably use all of that, but if we get done a bit faster, so much the better, I would imagine. As usual, we are recording the webinar today, and you'll be able to pick that up on our YouTube channel or Learning Hub tomorrow, as per usual, in the usual place. But if I do remember, then you'll also get an email just letting you know that it's ready to watch as well. Now, you're very welcome and encouraged to submit your questions at any time, and of course you've discovered the chat window, most of you already, on the left hand side. Just to kind of separate out the questions from the chat, if you do have a question about what we're doing today, then try to put that in the Q&A tab that you can see next to the chat. That just helps to separate it out, as otherwise it can get lost in the chat easily and I might miss it as well. Of course, if you're not interested in chatting or asking questions, you can get a bit more space to see Capture One on screen, just if you tap on the little down arrow in the top right hand corner, and then that will hide the chat for you as well. So without further ado, let us begin. So let's move over to Capture One. So you should be able to see that on screen now. Image wise, we've got a fair old selection here. We probably won't be able to get through all of them, but we do our best to kind of pass as many different sort of styles and editing techniques that we can, and then try and get through as many as possible. All right, so enough of me talking. Let's go to the first shot, and this is a photo by, let's see if I get it right, because I know Fabienne is actually listening. Fabienne Bezeneg. So let's see how I did with that. You can correct me if that's not correct. But Fabienne was very kind enough to supply me with a bunch of images for this webinar, which is always very useful. So if I didn't do your name justice, I am sorry. Okay, so editing approach for these kinds of shots isn't, really any particular difference from sort of normal photography. What I prefer to do is get my sort of crop perspective stuff down first. I find it hard to visualize the shot if it's not cropped or rotated correctly. Then we throw in some base corrections, exposure, contrast, and so on. And then we can look at things like local adjustments, dodging and burning, and so on and so forth. So, nearly it. Oh, that's good, Fabienne. Glad I was close. Okay, so first of all, am I fit screen? Yes. So I would begin by changing the crop, as I said. So we're going to grab our crop cursor tool up here, and I'm just going to crop out a little bit of the foreground like so, just so it's disproportions, which I prefer. Now, in terms of editing, we've obviously got this guy sitting in the window enjoying his coffee or something else, which is our main subject. So I kind of want to draw the eye towards that a little bit. But before we get to that, let's just put in a few base corrections. Now I'm just going to warm this up ever so slightly, as I imagine this is a warmer place than where I'm sitting currently. So let's just adjust for that. And in terms of exposure, contrast, and so on, I tend to always have a little look at the levels tool before anything else. And this is a pretty good example because we can see that on the right hand side, we've kind of got bit of space here between the edge of the levels tool and where our data actually starts. Now, the disadvantage of this is that if we have any gaps sort of either side of the levels tool, is that we can get sort of a flatter image. Now, this isn't an extreme example, but you might see some, other image examples where really all the data is kind of in the midtones and then it looks really flat. And if you don't correct for that, then obviously you've got a flat image and more work to do adjusting contrast and so on and so forth. So a very simple thing that you can do is just hit on the magic wand icon or auto adjustments, as you can see, for that one, and that will just correct our levels nicely. And what this does, looking at the histogram at the top, let's reset that, you see it gives us a nice spread of tones all the way from shadows to highlights. Now if we want to control our midtones, we can also just grab the middle slider and then we can darken down our midtones a little bit like so. Now I favour a little bit of contrast, so I'm going to pump some of that in and also add a bit of clarity as well. Now not too much because I don't want to over process. Now the important difference between clarity, this slider here, and contrast, they're essentially doing a very similar thing, except the clarity is only going to be operating in the midtones. So it's not going to make the shadows too dark. So if I really push contrast, then we lose all our data. If we did a similar thing with clarity, then it's much, much less aggressive, but really adds some nice pop to the pictures. Okay, now by doing those adjustments, let's just bring our highlights down a bit, like so. By doing those adjustments, we've kind of lost a little bit what's going on inside the coffee shop. So the obvious thing to do is, of course, is to lift up our shadows. So let's bump up the shadows. That's fine, but the negative sort of impact of that is if I lift the shadows, and I'm going to do it a bit more extreme, it's happening here, so in that center window. It's also happening over on the left hand side, and it's also kind of making the suit, I don't know if that's supposed to be a Trump cartoon or something else, but it's also flattening the suit off a little bit on our cartoon character here, which I don't want. I really want to focus it on the window here pretty much, just so we can get a little hint of what's going on inside the shop. Now the obvious way to do that is to just use a layered adjustment and target some adjustments to one particular spot. Now if you've watched a webinar before, then you'll know my preferred method is maybe a slightly longer one, but I think it gives you more control over the end result, and this is a really good example of it as well. So what I would do is that I first want to visualize what my adjustments can do, and then I'm going to apply it, if you like, retrospectively to the photo. So what does that mean? So first of all, we're going to go to our layers tool and we're going to make a new filled layer. So if I press M on my keyboard, then you see that's a layer which covers the whole image. So now we can play around with various different adjustments. So in the high dynamic range tool, I'm going to open up the shadows. Now it's happening everywhere, but that's fine. And I might just add in a bit more contrast as well, so it doesn't get too flat. So that's doing what I want it to do in the coffee shop. I could see if I lift up my blacks a little bit as well, that will also just put in a tiny bit more detail as well. So that's kind of what I want to go on here, and I'm going to go to the maximum that I think I'm going to need. Now right now it's affecting everything, so if we turn this layer on and off, we can see exactly what it's doing. Let's just name this shadows. So what I want to do is to be able to pop or paint this into just those particular areas. So I'm going to right click and we're going to say clear mask. So we're back to square one, but by clearing the mask, we've still got my shadows, blacks, and contrast adjustment like so. So now we can brush that back in. So if I right click, now you'll see that my flow is set nice and low. Now first of all, let's go to 100. This would be your default brush settings. So now if I start brushing, right away we get the full might of those adjustments immediately. Now that's starting to look a little bit fake, because your brain knows no way it's probably going to be that bright in that shop. So we need to sort of have a little bit of finesse about it. So let's clear that mask again, and now I'm going to right click and change my flow down to a nice low number. Now if any of you watched a tutorial or webinar before, you'll know what this does, but it's always worth a refresher. So with flow at 100 like it was at the first time, my adjustments of exposure, what did I do, high dynamic range, contrast, they were added to the photo in one brush stroke. So that was a little bit too, if you like, too much, too harsh. So by turning flow down, This makes your paintbrush drier, if you like, and it will build up the adjustment slowly so we can moderate it in different areas of the shot. Now I'm using a pen, exactly the same if you're using a mouse, no different. Principle is completely identical. So let's turn that down. So now when I start brushing back and forth, it's going to build up nice and slowly. So now I can just paint in a little bit here, a little bit over by the door, a bit more there, and stop. And then if I want to, we could just open up that spot a little bit more as well. So it's much more subtle than it was before. So if we turn our layer off and back on, you can see what it's doing. Now the nice thing is, if you kind of went a bit too keen somewhere, you can simply switch to your eraser, which is just E on the keyboard, and then just knock it back out. So you can play back and forth quite easily, and then it looks really super nice and subtle. So if we turn this on and off again, you can see the result. Now to finish this one, we're going to make another new layer, just an empty layer, and we're just going to call this a radial mask. And using this icon here, so the last one in the layers tool, we're going to draw a radial mask just so we can focus the eye a little bit more into the center. Now where you start drawing, that will be the center of your radial mask. So I'm going to draw out something like this. To feather it, we can grab the edge of the mask to make it softer, or we can make it harder. So I want it nice and soft, and then I'm just going to hover to the middle line and rotate it a little bit like so. So now if I press M on the keyboard, you can see the radial mask that we've made, and I want to darken down the edges a little bit. Now typically we could use exposure, but the issue with using exposure is that it brings down everything by the same amount, so making it the shadows sometimes a bit too dark. So maybe a better tactic is to use brightness. And what brightness does is just target the midtones a little bit more. So if we take the brightness down, we can push it a little bit harder, and it's a bit more subtle as well. Now if I go back to the background, I'm just going to take saturation down a bit, and also on my radial mask I might take down saturation a little bit as well, so all the color, if you like, is in the center. So I think that's pretty much good for me. Fabienne, I hope we've done your photo justice. To see where we started, if we hold Option down and reset, then we can see before and after. And there's loads of dynamic range in this shot, so let's go to the background and just open up the shadows. We got bags of detail in there, so there's plenty to play around with. Fabienne, I can't remember which camera you've got. I think it's a XT2. So I've been shooting with an XT2 as well. Great camera, and you might think, we're going to be on XT4 soon, has just been announced. So you might think XT2, oh, that's really old, it's surely not going to be any good for dynamic range and so on. Any camera in the past 5 years has got a pretty good flexibility, so you can really open up the shadows without fear. Like if we go into, let's go to 200-300%. So what are we on? ISO 800, and it's still pretty clean. I might be tempted to bump up the noise reduction a little bit, but to be honest, if we were going to put this up online or on screen, that noise would not be obtrusive at all. If we were to do a really super big print, then maybe we might notice it. But if anything, if we wanted to just get rid of that last bit of noise, we could just open up or increase luminance noise reduction a tiny bit. It's not going to, oh, hang on. Let's see. Sorry, just had a strange message come up on the webinar, which I haven't seen before. Let's let them in, sorry. I must have added something to the webinar that doesn't let people in after a certain time. So sorry to Michelle, who had to knock to come in, but he should be in here now. Anyway, as I was saying, I might be tempted to bump that up a bit. Noise reduction in Capture 120, quite different to 12. You might feel it looks very similar when you look at the same shot, but these sliders have a much better impact. You can push them harder and you have a better result. Okay, let's have a look at some questions. I'm on my own today, so normally I have on Andre helping me out, but he's not around today. So if I don't get to as many questions or you don't see anyone answer in the background, that's why. So let's see. Is it better to use levels to recover this gap of data or use exposure? Not quite sure what you meant, Luca, but levels, like my feeling for levels is that's something you kind of set in the beginning. You don't necessarily use it as an adjustment because you want to use it to get that good tonal range, and then you can go on to change that tonal range with curves, contrast slider, or anything after that. But I personally don't think it's great editing. Like if I wanted to make my blacks darker, I wouldn't clip the blacks because we're going to lose data. I would prefer to use something like the black slider if you did want a nice rich dark black, which you can push much harder without clipping. The different modes of clarity, I, to be honest, only stick with the first one, natural. This is kind of an evolution of Capture One. So Classic was added in Capture One 6, I think. Capture One 7 or 8, we had neutral and punch. So punch kind of does the same thing, but it changes. See, you can just see a bit more saturation. It's slightly more aggressive. So I would make natural your go-to. If you like to have a bit more saturation thrown in as well, then you can use punch. But natural is by far the one that allows you to push it the hardest without it looking mucky. Are there any features I'm using in 20 which are missing in 12? So everything you've seen so far is available in 12, but we will, except for the black sliders, which we will use a bit later as well, and really super handy as well. Is there an option to see the clipping automatically? No, you can use a shortcut just to tap on the exposure warning, and I set my exposure warnings in the preferences to be a little bit more cautious. So my clipping starts at like 250, I think it is, for the highlights, and like 4 for shadows. So the fact that I'm seeing a little bit of clipping here, I'm not worried about, because if I put my cursor over here, I'm just kind of on the limit, you can see with the blue. But also pay attention to your histogram as well. Unless you're doing like wildly crazy stuff, you should be safe as well. Curve settings for midtones darker, that's also a good trick on the vignette. That's from Kevin, definitely. Details in the noise reduction, that's kind of like a bias Daniel was asking between preserving fine details and sort of removing them. So if we zoom in up here, if we crank details to the right, you might see a bit more noise creep in. If we put details to the left, then it softens everything a little bit as well. So you can see we're kind of losing edge definition. If we go this way, then we get a little bit more back. But it also depends how much noise there is on the image as well. If it's not very noisy, the detail slider won't do a lot. But if you've got like 12,000 ISO, then you're going to see more dramatic effects with that default slider. And final question, so we can move on from Peter. The defaults for sharpening and noise reduction, they are camera specific. So even though for noise reduction you always see 50, 50, 50, depending on the ISO and the camera type, what's going on under the hood might be a little bit different. So the default noise and default sharpening should give you a very good start point. So this came up this morning about should you always adjust sharpening? No, not really. I think our defaults are pretty good. If we go back to say Capture One 6, 7 and 8, I think our sharpening was a bit overkill. It was too sharp. But now I think we've got the balance right between keeping a shot nice and sharp and not too noisy as well. So don't feel you always have to adjust them. Yeah, that's a good comment from Sharon that the sliders start in the middle for 20. So Capture One was a bit weird that it was the only one with like the high dynamic range tools that started at 0. Now they sit in the middle, so you can go darker and lighter, not just in one direction, which is kind of weird. Okay. Let's go to another shot. Let's go to Tokyo. So this isn't one of Fabienne's yet. We'll come back to Fabienne. This is from Zoe. Let's just make sure that's on 0. Now this one, like actually a lot of photos out the camera, they look pretty good. So, you know, anything we're doing from this point is like creative input, you know, creative cropping, improving a little bit, focusing the eye and so on. But out of camera results are often, you know, pretty super as well. But hey, we can always improve something. So let's just change the crop ever so slightly. Now this one, I just want to rotate it a tiny bit, but I just want to nudge it a really small amount. So my favored way to do that is find the rotation and flip tool, click into the box, and then you can just use up and down cursor keys to minutely nudge the cropping. Now if you do shift up and down, then you can move it in slightly bigger increments. So I just want to nudge it like that. So it's only a little bit, but I just somehow think on this shot before and after is just better rotated a tiny bit like so. Okay, so next thing to do, our levels are pretty good. We've got a good spread from shadow to highlight. If I press auto, brings in the shadows a tiny bit, but you know, not by a great deal. Contrast wise, I think I'm not going to touch it, but I will add a little bit of clarity as well, just like so. And again, you can push clarity quite hard before it starts messing up shadows and highlights and so on. Now it's a little bit bright up the top here. Now you could argue, well, we should correct for that, and to fully correct for it we could go to -100, but if you were standing in that street looking up at the bright sky, the sky would look naturally bright to you anyway. So personally, I now think that looks unrealistic and we've lost some of the atmosphere. So I might be tempted to bring it back a tiny bit, but I wouldn't fully correct it. Now shadow wise, we're pretty happy. I might just open the shadows a little bit, and then we can talk a bit about what the black slider does. And then what this does is quite different to shadows in that this is really focused on the very sort of darkest tones of the shot. So the darkest blacks, and then the whites is the brightest whites. So it's not doing the same thing as shadow recovery. So if we like peek under the hood of the car for a second, that's a little bit too close. So if we bring the blacks down, what it's doing is just darkening, if you like, the very darkest areas. If we turn on our exposure warnings, then we can see what's going on like so. So it's just really darkening down those darkest areas. Now you could argue, well, isn't that doing the same as levels? And it isn't, because levels will have a much broader effect, whereas this will be targeted just on those darkest areas. So you can push this a little bit harder before your blacks start to sort of lose all their detail and so on. So we're reading, you know, 8s, 7s, 9s and so on. If we pull this in, then very quickly we start to get to, you know, blacked out or losing our blacks. So it's nice for just giving yourself those rich blacks, but without blocking up your shadows too much. So that's just a nice little tweak for that. Whites I'm going to leave alone because I don't want to make this any brighter. And that will be pretty good. But I want to put a color grade onto this photo as well, or at least experiment with a color grade. Now we could go straight to our color balance tool over here if we wanted to, but I prefer to do the color grading on a layer. Why? Just because it gives us a bit more flexibility. So if our color grading or tinting or color edits, whatever you want to call it, sit on a layer, then it gives us more flexibility to maybe just adjust it, make it a bit weaker, make it a bit stronger, add some other adjustments in as well. Doesn't really take much more time, and I believe it's worth the benefit as well. So we're going to make a new filled layer. We call this CG for color grade, like so. Again, if we press M on the keyboard, you can see that mask that was created, and that's over the whole shot. So let's just throw in a bit of tealy shadows, and we can push it quite hard because we can always retrospectively reduce it as well, and some warmer midtones. And I'm also, as part of this same layer, let's take the saturation down a bit as well. So now when we turn our color grading layer on and off, that's without it, and then with it, like so. And if we feel it's too strong, then of course we can back it off with our opacity or bring it back. Or we can push this even harder. We're sort of close to black and white there. And then dial this back until we see something that we feel looks kind of nice. So we got lots of flexibility by putting it on a layer. And then if we feel that, well, we don't like it, we can just turn it off or discard that layer. But that's just a nice little extra subtle change like so. Okay, that one I'm going to leave there. That's more than enough. So let's have a look at, let's see, the questions. Okay, Q&A, here we go. Let's see. Again, Sharon coming from Lightroom, or Sharon, I think. Something that annoys me, there's no auto straighten for a group of photos. So do you go photo by photo and straighten it with the tool? Well, there's a couple of ways you can straighten. You can use the horizon tool here, which you can use vertically like so, or horizontally. So if we had a horizon, we can rotate about that horizon. So you can use that. So that's a little bit quicker as well. But I agree, it would be nice to have something auto as well. Chris says, what's the benefit of overdoing it on the layer and then reducing the opacity over getting the saturation right on the layer? So let's reset that, because that's a good question. So we've got our color grading on our layer, and then it's because I'm indecisive and I'm not quite sure. So by going a little bit too far this way, then I've got every incarnation from no color grading to max color grading from 0 to 100. So we've kind of made our own filter, if you like, that you can then dial in and think, well, where does it actually look nice? And it's just playing in combination with the two. And of course, I might come back to this tomorrow and think, what was I thinking? That's way too weedy or too strong or whatever, and then I can change it. Or if I decided again, what the hell was I thinking? Was I colorblind today? I could just get rid of that entire layer if I wanted to. So it's really just a flexibility. Okie dokie. And last one before we must move on. Is there a shortcut on the keyboard for viewing before, after? No. So currently it has to be Option like so. So hold your Alt key down and hit on the reset. But again, like Sharon was saying, that could be another feature what would be nice to throw in as well. Okay, before we run out of time just on questions, let's go to the next shot. So where should we go? What should we pick this time? Definitely we're going to come back to this one at some point. This one we didn't do this morning. Let's go for this one, because this one is actually quite an old shot I took in Chicago quite some time ago. First of all, that's not how they were built. So let's rotate right. Something we rarely have to do now because camera sensors always pick this up. Not on this occasion. So let's rotate right. We're going to crop this down a bit. Now remember, if you want to rotate, you can just hover outside the edge of the crop mask, and then we can rotate quite nicely. So I'm just going to kick them that way a little bit. And don't forget also in your crop tool, if you need to, you can say crop outside the image. So if you just wanted a little bit more, blue sky over here, and you wanted to fill that in Photoshop or Affinity, then you can go beyond the bounds of the shot and just fill that in with content aware or whatever. So it's quite a nice little feature should you need to do it. Okay, so I'm happy with that crop. Now this is a fairly easy one, but there was a nice trick that we could do with the color editor. Now this has got a massive spectral highlight there. So if we turn on exposure warning, I doubt no amount of highlight recovery is going to bring that back. No, it's not. So that might kind of reflect how the levels tool looks as well. So if we say auto, it's not going to budge on that end because it's got this big spectral highlight, but I might be tempted just to push it a tiny bit, just so the image isn't too flat, and get some of our midtones back. Now if we throw in some clarity, let's see, we can push that to 100, and whilst it's maybe a bit too aggressive, it's not too bad. If we went to classic, the old method, and we did it, See, first of all, we don't get quite so much change at all. So it's not really doing a great deal. If we go to neutral, which was capture 1.8, we can do so, but it's a little bit aggressive, whereas the most modern method just gives us the most flexibility. So I'm going to land around there. Now, if I remember from years ago taking this, we have just got a little bit of extra warmth bouncing off the windows here. So to bring that out a bit more, we could also play with our white balance slightly, just a touch. But let's see, if we pick with the color editor, so I'm going to go to the advanced color editor and just pick around here and see what we get. So we're picking up some reds, yellows, I guess. So if I bring up the saturation, and if you look at where it is, it's just kind of in that area. It is where that burnt out bit is, so I think changing the brightness, it's going to look weird, definitely. But if we bump the saturation up and down, we can actually make it look like there's a little bit more sunshine, maybe not that much, just bouncing off the left-hand side. Now in hindsight, I think I've rotated that a bit too far, or not quite enough. I'm going to go back a bit more that way, like so. And again, if we look at my crop, I was just cropped outside, and away we go. So relatively simple one. If we hold our Alt key down and go to reset, before and after, it's just a little bit flat and a little bit uninteresting, but much better with just a few basic corrections. Now maybe to finish also with our color editor, if we pick the blue, then we could also darken that down a touch as well. Alrighty, let's have a look at some more questions. Could you demo the Luma range? I'm not sure, Wayne, if I had one that's good for that today, but let's have a little look. I never crop to a specific aspect ratio, Daniel is asking. Is it my old school darkroom brain taking over and telling me to do a standard size? You know what, am I on screen? No, I never really crop to a standard size. I mean, I come from the darkroom, so I was used to certain aspect ratios, and you can, if you right click, we can go to whatever aspect ratio you want, but I just find that a bit limiting. Like when I will crop to a specific aspect ratio, let's go unconstrained, so let's just do that. Now let's say I had to output this and it had to go to specific dimensions, then what I would do is so this is the one we did, I would say image clone variant, so that gives me a virtual copy, and then now this one, let's say it was going to be printed or whatever, and it had to be a particular aspect ratio. Now by cloning my variant means that I've kept the one with my freedom of creative expression crop, whatever you want to call it. And now on this one, if we bring up the crop tool, right click, and I know this has to be 4:5, then as soon as I grab it, it goes to my particular aspect ratio, like so. So that's the only time when I go to a specific ratio. Otherwise, I find it a little bit annoying to fit within certain constraints. But it's definitely a good question, Daniel, because let's say if we go to service I use a lot is TouchNote for sending postcards. It's great. You can print your own postcards and post them off and so on. But obviously, if you don't fit to their printing dimensions, then you're going to have white borders or they crop it or whatever. So in that case, I always make another variant and then crop that particular output to the correct dimensions. So that's when I do, but it's a good question. Keystroke for full screen, that is F, I believe, on my set. Where is it? View, full screen, like so. I don't know if that works on the webinar. I don't know if that might freak out the screen sharing. Now on Windows, there isn't as nice a full screen as there is on Mac. So we know it's a deficiency, but on Mac you can actually do a proper screen. Adjustments from one layer to another, not just the mask, Tom was asking. So we can copy the mask, but you cannot copy the adjustments. But someone actually had, this came up a while back, And we're going to do one with layers in a minute, and someone actually came up with a good technique for that, Tom, but I can't remember what it was, so we'll come back to that. Suggestions, improvements for Capture One, that just goes send to support, because they log everything and add it to something we call product board, which basically logs every single piece of feedback that comes in, and then obviously we can see what's popular, what's less popular, and make product decisions based on that. But please send them into support. Everything gets logged as well. What did I use for postcards? Touch Note. It's awesome. It's really good fun if you like sending printed media. Okay, let's find something else. Let's go to this guy because he's quite interesting the way. This is a good old darkroom kind of comparison. So we're going to make a new variant. This again is from Fabienne. So thanks, Fabienne. So first of all, we can see it's a bit wonky, but what I might do is use the perspective correction. So that's this cursor tool up in the middle, and you can see when you choose it, you get these two lines which appear on the shot. So what we need to do is tell Capture One the error. So I'm going to pick this corner or drain pipe, and then I'm going to pick this wall edge over here. Now the further out you can find the reference, the better. So if I could pick this wall in the top right hand corner, I would do, but I don't, I've run out of image, so I'm just going to use this line here. But the further you can go out, the more accurate the correction is. And let's say apply, like so. Excuse me. So that's nice and straight. I'm going to crop again. Let's just go back to unconstrained. My rogue cropping, so I'm going to go something like that. It's good for me. And now with this, we've got like extreme sort of tonal range because it's super bright up here and very dark down here. Now it's cooler because this is sitting in the shadows, so I do want to warm everything up slightly overall, so it's a better match. Now we want to obviously brighten up what's going on down here. So we could bring up our shadows, but if we go to around here, now I think that looks really super fake. It just doesn't look right. It's not pleasant to open up the shadows to this extent. We've sort of lost any lighting that was going on, and it's just not very believable. But what I would do is I just want to kind of brighten up this area. If we imagine drawing, and we don't have to imagine, we can do it with annotations. So if you imagine, what I want to do is just kind of brighten up this area, but nice and a bit more of that, but nice and subtly, if you like. We don't need to brighten everything up because it looked kind of horrible, nasty and fake, if you like. We just want to raise it a little bit. So let's get rid of that annotation. Let's clear that. And we're going to do pretty much what we did before, but super subtle. So we're going to make a new field layer. Let's get rid of me. I thought I was on screen. And we're going to call this Shad Lift, whatever you want to call it. And open up our shadows just like we did. But now, of course, I don't mind that it's going to look bad. We're just kind of visualizing the max that I would want it to be in this area. So just around the maximum in this area. And it doesn't matter if it's too much because we're going to brush it back in carefully. Now we're going to right click and say clear mask. Grab my brush and we're going to make this nice and big, super soft, very low flow. Let's try sort of 10 first of all. And now we can start to brush in. Now for me, that's kind of coming in a bit too quick. So what I'm going to do is clear the mask again, and then we're going to make that even like around 4. So now we can just gradually open up our shadows where we think it's good. Maybe a little bit more around where he's standing, ever so slightly. And I'm going to make my brush smaller and then just open up the shop door a touch a little bit more. Now again, if we think that was too much, we can either hit E for erase, because I think I might have gone a bit too far on him. So that was a couple of swipes there. Or we can bring our opacity back down and turn our layers on and off, and you can see just where we've opened up those shadows a bit. Now it's maybe too much, so I'm just going to take that down a bit and just brighten up our shot overall slightly, like so. Now the trick is, of course, is that you want it to look natural. It has to be believable. So the way we did it before, just by opening up shadows everywhere, maybe wasn't so nice. But if I showed you this photo now, hopefully there's a good chance that you would not realize that I'd been sneaky and just opened up the shadows a little bit in this zone. But the trick is to have that nice low flow so it builds up nice and subtly. Now if we want to really see what the mask looks like, we can say display grayscale mask. So if we do that, we can see exactly what the mask looked like. So that was the shop door, and then this is kind of around here where the guy is, and then it's just subtly sort of fading off around the edges, so it's nice and soft. So that gives us more of a believable mask. So M now to come back out of that, or Option M to display our grayscale mask. So Option M, as you can see, is a good shortcut. Now I don't think I'd sort of change much more to that. I might sneak in just a bit of normal vignetting. Again, I think maybe just ever so sort of slightly brighter overall, as it was just a tiny bit of highlight recovery. Maybe that's too much. See, this is what I'm saying, who was asking, like, if I came to this shot tomorrow, then I might edit it completely differently. We can actually see what it looks like. So that was this morning, that's this afternoon. So that's exactly the same person, two quite different edits. And that's Fabien's. So again, that's Fabien, that's me this morning, that's me this afternoon. So, you know, it just goes to show that with the best intentions, I don't necessarily end up with the same thing each time. So this morning it was a bit warmer. So again, I don't know what I prefer, but you've got three choices there that we can pick through, like so. So Fabien likes it a bit more contrasty. So as it's your photo, Fabien, let's add in a bit more contrast. Yes, it is hard to see the keystone lines, Andreas was asking. That a few comments have come in on that, and I agree. It would be nicer if you could make these keystone lines a bit broader. The keystone, who was that asking? Dominic. It's very simple. It's just describing the error. So again, if let's just find something different. It can be vertical, horizontal, or both. So I'm just looking for a particular shot. If I can find it, if I can't. So here we go. So a really wonky shot. So we've got vertical, horizontal, or both ways. So if I was to choose both ways and then grab and say, well, the corner of my door should be here, the corner of my door is here, the bottom corner of the door is there, and the bottom corner of the door is here. So that's what I want to be square. So now if I hit apply, then it fixes that perfectly. So it's either a case of finding the verticals, horizontals, whatever, or the whole thing as a square, and then Capture One does a super nice job of fixing it. Is there a quick dodge and burn technique? Well, let's dodge and burn on the next one, because that's a good thing that you've been seeing. Now, there isn't, depends what you class as quick, really. What you saw with the first one, with the guy in the coffee shop, and the last one we did, that's kind of a dodge. But of course, the tool that you use to change the exposure or whatever else in the shot is down to you. So you saw us using shadow recovery, but it could be a curve, it could be all kinds of stuff. So we try and find something with dodge and burn as well. How did I toggle through those versions? I'm not sure what you mean, Lois. Do you mean going back through the other shots? That's just Command right and left. So that's just for going through the shots, if that's what you meant. Otherwise, let's know and we'll find something else. All right, last questions? No, let's go to the next one. So let's find something we can dodge and burn. Oh, I know. Where's the wedding shot? Let's just go back to this collection. So let's say image, new variant, like so. So I took this ages ago. I think you can see me. There's me right there in the iPhone. So let's do this one, because we can dodge and burn this one a little bit actually. So first of all, base corrections, it's a bit cold, so let's just warm it up ever such a little bit. A bit more contrast and clarity, like so. And a vignette just to focus the eye a bit. Now, I want to see the, not because I want to see myself, but we want to see what's going on in the iPhone a little bit more. Let's also bring highlights down. So what we can do is let's zoom in. Let's go in a bit closer. Make a new filled layer and think about what adjustments make this look better. So let's brighten that a bit. We could probably have it more contrasty. The white balance is different, so we could probably warm that up a bit. Let's open up our shadows ever so slightly, like so. So that's kind of a bit more of a better treatment for the iPhone itself. We could actually white balance off the ground there if we wanted, but it's not quite right. So let's try that. So now we've got better for the iPhone. So if we zoom back out again, that's obviously affecting the whole shot. So let's right click and clear our mask, and then just call that iPhone. Grab our brush, and again, I would never start with a flow of 100. I think it's always best to try and draw it in gradually, and then we can just bring out our phone a little bit more, like so. And again, if it's too much, just blend it in a little bit as well. But that just brings it a little bit brighter, like so, so we can see what's going on screen. Now for dodging and burning, there is no hard and fast technique really. It's basically make a layer with your brightening adjustment on it, make a layer with your darkening adjustment on it, and then use flow to do so. But I never use the same adjustment because it depends very much on the photo at hand. So let's say you wanted to just brighten up this area a little bit where her hair's going into darkness. So that there could be lots of different ways to do that. So I always start by making a new filled layer. So again, that's over the whole shot. Oh, let's hide me because I'm covering up her hair. And now what's the best way to brighten this area? But this could be for any kind of application. So it could be a shadow lift. It could be, if we go to curves, if we grab our cursor, and if you see wherever I hover, you get a little orange line dancing over the curve itself. So you can see this is a deep shadow, but I might want to brighten a mid-tone, for example, or we might want to play with a highlight. So again, let's say we wanted to brighten this area a bit. This is kind of sitting just around this area of the curve. So I've got a custom little brightness just of that area without affecting not too much else. So now I could go in here, right click and say clear mask, grab my brush, right click, make that a bit bigger. Again, nice low flow, and when I'm brushing in, I'm only affecting this bit. So I'm actually not going to affect any highlights, or if we do that, or any shadows too much. So now if we just want to brighten up this area, it's kind of a targeted brush almost as well. So even if I'm like spilling into the neighboring areas, it's kind of controlled to some extent too. So if we turn that layer on and off, you can see it's just brightening the back of her hair like so. Now I could go over here, it will probably have some effect, but it's not having a massive amount of effect on her hair because that's like a darker tone, it's sitting right down there. So really this kind of brightening adjustment or dodging adjustment was catered very specifically for that tone. So that's what I tend to do. I don't really have a preset, mostly because you can't save a layered preset unfortunately, but no two image is the same in that respect. So it just means we can get really sort of nice results. So if we were to find another one, let's take our nice lady here, let's say new variant. So again, this one is pretty good out of camera. What I would do for this one is go to my rotation and just nudge it a little bit till it's about right. like so. Really not a great deal to do, but again, what I might want to do is kind of selective, like a selective vignette. Like let's say I just want to darken some areas. So I would make a new filled layer, and then an overall darkening would be exposure, but you just have to be mindful that you're not making the shadows too dark. So I would probably do the majority of brightness and a little bit of exposure, but really not too much, because we don't want to start to clip the blacks, which we're going to there with exposure. So if I play with the brightness, if it's getting too much, there's actually no reason why we couldn't open the shadows a little bit as well. So now if we turn this layer on and off, that's giving an overall sort of darkening effect. But once again, if I right click and say clear mask, then I could just again have my nice low flow, nice big brush, and then I could just selectively darken where I wanted to. So almost like a radial mask, but a mask that you control, for example. Now if I wanted to make that stronger, I could just actually increase my adjustments like so. Depends how dark we want our staircase to be. And if I think I've overcooked it, then of course we can bring our opacity down. Or I could get my erase tool and think, well, it's a bit dark in that corner. Let's just bump that up a bit like so. Now, if I want to brighten her, then we're doing the opposite. So if we make a new layer, let's just call that brighten, B-R-I-T-E-N. This one was darken. I just tend to use D&L as my shorthand. So if I want to brighten her a little bit, then I would probably, if we just open up, she's mostly sitting in a mid-tone. Oops, I didn't fill my layer. So I need to say fill mask. So she's mostly sitting in a mid-tone, but I don't want to lose her highlight, so I might bring them down a bit. And now I can right click, say clear mask, grab my brush. Doesn't matter if I'm overlapping my sort of darken layer, then I can just brighten her up a little bit as well. So if we turn brighten off, then before and after, and then darken off before and after. So it's quite a different shot now, because we really did put like a big focus, whoops, kicking something under the desk. We did put a big focus on her. So if we just reset the layers, Alt key, click on the little reset button, that's without layers. She's kind of doesn't stand out from the background nicely because it's very bright on the left hand side. And then if we bring our layers back in, then we've focused it quite nicely. Once again, if I showed you that picture, would you know I'd done a local adjustment? Maybe, because it's perhaps a little bit aggressive. So I just bring that like that a bit, but it looks nice and subtle, and now we've kind of focused the light where we wanted it to be. So looking at the questions in chat, let's see. Stephen, why do you clear mask before making adjustments? Because remember, when we make our mask, it's a filled mask. So we're saying new filled layer. If we press M, it's over the whole shot. So that allows us to visualize what's going to happen rather than drawing a brush first and then making adjustments. We can really see exactly what our adjustment is going to do. Then we can clear it and then we go. Now, opposite Stephen, can't you brush in where you want the adjustment? Yes, but how am I going to see what it's going to do? So let's make a new variant. So we're back to square one again. So this is how it came out of the camera. You might think, oh, I'd really like to darken certain areas for sure. So let's make a new layer, and we're going to call this, same as before, darken. So I want to sort of darken some areas. So I'm going to grab my brush, press M. I think I want it darker here. I want it darker there, maybe sort of around this area and here, and you know, something like that. So I want to darken those areas. So now if I grab brightness, I can do it, but everything is getting darker by the same amount. Because if you look at my mask, Option M, then my mask is very crude. It's either on or off. There's no in between. Now if we go back to the other technique, so this one here, and we look at the grayscale mask, see, it's a lot more subtle. So it allows you to really what we did in the darkroom, because in the darkroom we were focusing light on a page, and then some areas we would use, don't have any suitable prop, but we would use a piece of paper with a hole cut in it, and then we would focus the light more on one area where we wanted it to be darker, a little bit over here, maybe tons over there, and so on. So you could really vary the exposure that was going on the paper. Now we're doing the same thing here, but it's in a nice subtle way, and I can really decide on the exact look that I want to have. Doing it the sort of other way by drawing the mask first, you can't predict the end result that you're going to get. So whilst you could argue, well, it takes you a little bit longer to do my way, the result you get is really by far much better. You can control the flow of the mask alone, but you don't know what it's going to do until you put it in. So again, let's go back to the other one here. So this guy here, let's clear that. So if we take my brush, I could take the flow down, and I could think, well, I want it quite dark here, but not quite so dark here, and a little bit here, and maybe some more here, but you don't know what that effect is going to have. So you're not really seeing the end result. Whereas if you do it this way, you can see the result as you start to brush. So as I'm brushing, this is my Brighten mask, very gradually the image is changing before my eyes. Now it's slow because it's only 4%, 8% actually, but it is actually happening before my eyes. It can't be done the other way. Now in the dark room, we had no bloody clue what we were doing, because we were just looking at a piece of white paper thinking, I really hope this works, because this is my 10th piece of paper and I'm running out of money to buy more paper, kind of thing, as an impoverished photography student. So this is much easier than it was, and again you've got loads of flexibility, and again if I thought that was too dark, I'll bring that back. If she's too bright, I can bring her down. Just so much control compared to the other method. Stephen's got it. Excellent. So I know it's a bit weird. It's like, well, why would you do that? That's like twice the work, but it's a better result. And I think we are pretty much out of time. Now I know that was a lot just kind of on one subject, but we actually did do a nice job with this shot after all that, and really spoke in depth about dodge and burn, which is really kind of one of the most useful techniques for street stuff, because the light is always kind of outside of your control. So if we review what we did, like we didn't need to here because that's kind of a pretty good, you know, basic shot, but it was very useful here when we're playing around in the cafe to open up the shadows just a little bit in the back, like so, not much. It was useful here just for getting our iPhone look going in, and then we could do our custom dodge and burn just for her hair tone. So again, you'd never know that this was brightened a little bit. Same goes for Indian lady here, of course. We've got loads of control and scope just for making her a bit brighter. So if we make a new, not a clone variant, a new variant, let's just stick them side by side. Let's hide the tools. We can zoom in a little bit. Let's see. So just the difference in lighting really and everything is just, you know, gives us much more control because we've got our additional layers and so on. So turning this off, brighten, here darken, just, you know, you can really sort of draw the eye where you want it to. Now you could argue, of course, well, that's not proper street photography because you've changed what happened. We've been doing it for years. Look at any darkroom annotation notes about the changes that we want to make. You know, this is exactly the same as been going on for, you know, hundreds of years or whatever with traditional photography. Now we don't have to do it in a smelly darkroom with chemicals and not really sort of see what we're doing as well. So I much prefer this technique. Yeah, and that's exactly right, Carsten. Using all the bells and whistles, but then really gauging when it's too much. This is why I always struggle with, a lot of HDR photography, because as soon as you, if you like, normalize the photo to something which has this like amazing tonal range where everything is kind of perfect, then it doesn't look real anymore. So because you're not used to looking at it. So you do have to be really careful when you're opening up shadows, dropping highlights, that it still actually looks like the scene in front of you, not some weird HDR on steroids, which just doesn't look quite right. So subtlety is really the key. And the whole point of having the flow control is to allow you to build up that adjustment and stop it when it looks right. And of course, go back with your opacity and dial it back if you went too far. Because sometimes when you're brushing, and also if your computer's taking a while to catch up, I'm very lucky, my computer's nice and fast, so it's real-time brushing. There's no delay or anything. But if it is taking a little while to catch up, then sometimes you can go too far and not realize it. So the easiest thing is to take the opacity back down. Okay, the last few questions. The difference between clone variant and new variant is, so if we just go to this one again, it is a lovely shot. It's from my friend Emily Teague, who's on our Instagram at the moment. So if we were to say new variant, it gives me a virtual copy but with no adjustments. If we say clone, so if I say clone, then you see it copies or gives me a virtual copy but with also the same adjustments as well. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these by now. But that's the different, either virtual copy with adjustments or virtual copy with no adjustments. Let's see. Last few questions and then we have to call it a day. Is there a way to go back to an image and see all the adjustments you've made in a list? Not really. I mean, what you could do is if you took any image, let's just take this one, and then you hit copy, then it shows you in the adjustments clipboard what tools you've used. So that's one thing that you can do. So if I just clear all the adjustments, select none, and then we say copy, then it will expand out and show you which adjustments you've used. But it's not like a text list, which would be nice actually, but that's probably the easiest way to do it. To hide the tools in Windows, it's the same thing, but if you look in the view menu under customize tools, then you'll see the shortcuts. Don't forget you can change the shortcuts in the edit menu. So tools here for show and hide is Command T, Command B for browser, and if you look in customize tools, you've got some other shortcuts and everything as well. But in your edit menu, you can always see a summary of the shortcuts as well. Let's see. Yeah, that's another good question, like dodge and burn on speed as well, Kevin. If you want to up your game a bit more, and we could do a whole webinar on it, as well as kind of making your adjustment specific with curves or whatever, on your dodge and burn layer, you can also add a luminosity range for that. So if you want to target when you're brushing only like mid-tone shadows, highlights or whatever, then you can slap a luma range on top of your mask, and then you've got an extra criteria as well. I don't find personally that I need to do that very much, but if you want to be super critical, that is a way to do it. So that's advanced stuff, Kevin. Well done. All right. Now, one thing I'll mention is that when this webinar ends, just stick around for a second, because it's going to take you to a web page to sign up for a really cool webinar that's coming up at the end of March. If you're interested in landscape, night photography, working in extreme weather conditions, then I'm partnering up with a guest, Rachel Ross Jones, who's a really cool photographer from Canada, part of the Sony Alpha collective, knows a ton of stuff about astrophotography, which I don't. And lots of people have been asking for a long time, probably 2 or 3 years now, if we can do something on Astro. So now it's coming at the end of March. So when I kill the webinar, it'll take you to that sign up page. But it'll be on the Learning Hub as usual. So hopefully you'll be able to find it if you can't stick around. Okay, everybody, thanks for joining again today. Enjoy the rest of your Thursdays. Sometime tomorrow, I'll get this up online. It might be later in the day, but you'll get an email when it's ready, and then you can come back and watch it if you need to. Thanks again, everybody, for joining me today. Sorry if we didn't get to all your questions, but it's just me on my own. There was rather a lot of you, so I hope we covered as many bases as possible. Take care and see you all again. Bye now.